When I think of the West Indian front room, I think of a space that was kind of loaded with a lot of meaning, in that traditionally it was not a room you were allowed to go in and mess up. There was another room for that. It was a place to receive visitors. It was a place that was very lively when you entertained, but it wasn't a place that you just slobbed around in. It was sacrosanct.
The front room of my family in Jamaica, in Kingston, was clearly a sort of middle-class Jamaican family house. That doesn't mean that it didn't have some of the features of a classic West Indian front room, because it was much more crowded than an English middle-class home would be. It had many of the appurtenances, but it was already straightened out. The relationship between objects and people in the place was kind of already straightened out by a sort of more European influence. So I think a much more authentic Jamaican front room was that in my grandmother's house in the country.
For example, when I went to see my Aunt Joan, who lives in Heartlands, and she lives, of course, which is in the countryside, we were put into the front room. And it was not an alien space for me at all visiting there, because everything, the glass fish, the crochet doily on the glass table, it was all there, the same as what my mum had back in England.
I would say that the Caribbean front room is accumulative. That's my memory of it. It doesn't. You don't have. After all, the creation of front rooms like that in England is a result of movement between the two places. You have to start again, and the sources from which you can put it together are obviously English, Western type of furniture and so on. Of course, you're looking for something which reminds you of the front rooms that you have left behind. So you're trying to reconstruct it out of the materials which are not indigenous to it. So there's a kind of break there. Whereas the front rooms in the Caribbean, I don't know, how many generations had lived in that house in the country in Jamaica. But everything there had come from another generation. So 2 or 3 generations were present in the room. And one of the things I liked about that front room was that I could interrogate my grandmother about the past of the family simply by saying, who is that a picture of? Or, where did that come from? Or, what is that object on the wall? Or, who gave you that glass dish, etc. So it's a storehouse of memories, really.
In Britain, I think it's almost the uniformity of it. When you went to different homes, it was almost like you could go from my mother's to my Aunt G to Miss Lynette to Miss Kathleen. They all had exactly the same objects and the same way that the rooms had been decorated, to the point where if my mum went to Doncaster Market and found some net curtains, she would then tell Miss Lynette, who would then go with my mother to get the same net curtains, and then they'd talk about how they were going to dress their windows.
When I think of a front room, I think of it as a place, it's a social space where you honour guests that are coming in and you kind of a little bit showing off. You're not entirely relaxed. You're kind of showing them that, you can entertain, that you have certain nice things, you've collected a certain amount. It's a space where, a little bit of, pomp setting and showing off is done. But it's very much a social space.
Well, I think this is really a question of how the West Indian front room in the Black British context intersects and overlaps with the respectable working class front room, because that tradition, if they both have a kind of Victorian ancestry, though differently interpreted in the colonial context from in the British context, but nevertheless there are variations on rather the same thing. But of course, many lower middle class people in the Caribbean, once they came to England, were working people. So there is a kind of class shift as you move from the Caribbean to the British context. And here, I would think it's closer. There, I would have said, in the Caribbean, it's closer to a Victorian parlour tradition. And here, I think it's closer to a respectable working class tradition.
The other thing I wanted to say about the West Indian front room is about cleanliness and neatness, because I think that it's really significant. whatever class of West Indian. You know that phrase, cleanliness is next to godliness? I have never ever encountered in any West Indian front room anything but an obsessional cleanliness.
It's not only the house looking good for when friends come round, when you're having visitors, but it was also about it looking good for yourselves. It's also, I think it's also a sign of how you feel about the person that's coming as well, or what you were, because you want them. It's not about it's not solely about showing off at all. I think it is about having respect for yourself, but also that you value the friendship of that person coming, that you want them to enjoy the space.
Okay, what are we talking about here? We're talking about a colonial setting, so of course the ideas of respectability, of moral approval, of right moral conduct, the right way of a family to belong together, is partly inherited from the colonizer. Where else would it come from? There weren't parlors in the tribal African societies from which slaves came. But we're talking about an authentic West Indian tradition, which of course has no authenticity about it. How can it have an authenticity about it? Because Caribbean society, there is precisely this amalgam of translations and modifications and borrowings and adaptations and transcriptions and appropriations. That's what it is. That's what Caribbean culture is. So of course the front room itself represents precisely a creative act of that kind. The paraffinite is of course principally an iconic object of the Black British front room. A lethal object, absolutely lethal. People must have been poisoned by those things. They smoked, they gave off fumes. You would always tell when it was going. Many people have been injured from starting fires, etc. It was horrendous, but of course it was the only way of getting cheap heating. So the paraffin heater became, not only in the front room but in the rest of the house, an absolutely important element in establishing a family home in the new Black British context, of course.
I did an ND course way back in the 80s in fashion design, and I went to the first cultural studies session, and there was a whole thing on taste, because Stephen Bailey had an exhibition on at the Boiler House, and the whole thing, they were showing us objects on a really ornate, overly decorated floral carpet. Then there was really heavily decorated wallpaper, and then there was that it's kind of Pyrex, but an orangey with an almost rainbow tint to it, dinner set and coffee set. And then they showed us the plastic pineapple ice bucket, and I went, but that's our home. We're kitsch, oh my God.
Wallpaper. Well, of course, that is a phenomenon of the Black British context and Black British front room, because there's no wallpaper, in the Caribbean. And wallpaper gave a new articulation to the front room, because you could choose your wallpaper. And I was always astonished at the way in which nobody ever chose a wallpaper that exactly matched the carpet. The carpet was plush, and the wallpaper was good quality, but there was a sort of principled discrepancy between the color, two different kinds of reds, never exactly the same, and two different patterns, one circular, one square, didn't matter. And this was about maximizing the variety of things you could say in the room. Why get only one pattern? Why should everything subscribe to one pattern if you could say three different things with the walls, the floor, and the back of the couch? Behind you are shutters, okay, which are just like a West Indian house. In the West Indian house they would be green. Wooden shutters that kept the inside of the room cool. And one of the things about the front room is, since people didn't go in and out of it, often the curtains were drawn or the shutters were shut, so it kept it, again, a kind of sense of sanctity and privacy about it. Well, I've wanted shutters in my living room for a very long time. I don't have fashionable blinds, you see. I have shutters. It's a rather Victorian touch. So, I have a red carpet. I mean, it's true that it's Middle Eastern, but nevertheless, it shades on the Caribbean maroon.
One of my aunts did have a couch in a fabric so hideous that I had got a migraine every time I looked at it. It was a horrible green with a stripe through it, and it managed to be both garish and dark. I don't know how it did this. It was just vile.
Yeah, well, I suppose, people of my generation should have recreated the minimalist, late 21st century room. And as you look around, you can see it's not what I've created. It's much more full of things, and things that I've inherited from other generations, Over there, for instance, is a cake stand. Now, what is a cake stand doing in my front room? I don't put any cake on it. It has the 4 television remote controls that are required for me to tune into the 21st century digital world.
I don't know. I remember once they have a mantelpiece, a fireplace, and having virtually nothing on it. Now that did look a bit stark, so I had to put some ornaments on there. And a friend came round, and he came because we just rearranged the living room and decorated it all white and things. And he came in and he said, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. When were you burgled?" And we went, "No, this is it. This is the look."
I definitely think that the front room was a shrine to women. I really think that, because I think that this was a room that women kind of envisaged. It was usually her taste that kind of created the room. It was her knickknacks. She chose them. She was the one who preserved the pictures. Quite often she was the one who paid for the things, but even more significantly, she was the one who preserved this shrine. It was her who made sure that children didn't go in there and mess it up, and husbands didn't think it was okay to go in there and drink. And it was her who made sure that it was meticulously cleaned and and maintained. It was her place, and it reflected her slow sort of accumulation of kind of memorabilia and life and effort and kind of work, really.
We had another room which it ended up being the television room, but before it became the television room, my dad had this incredible cocktail cabinet, and that was in that room. So I'm just trying to think, I think they were 2 different spaces, and that was definitely where my dad watched cricket, where his mates again would be there chatting. So I think, yes, the front room was more a feminine space, it was more my mum's space.
But if I had a huge house, I would have a nice dedicated front room. I couldn't resist it psychologically, because to me it feels somehow like a lack not to have that, and to have a room where everybody mucks in all the time. I would have a lovely dedicated front room in which I could force people to leave and make them come in only at special occasions, and I could tell them when to come out, and it would be perfect all the time.
Of course, in the Caribbean, religion is always more important than you think it is. It's always the neglected element, and so it wouldn't be the front room without the reminder of a religious connection.
Yes, I think that the West End front room definitely is a kind of quasi-religious space in that sense, because I also associate it with Sundays and holidays, particularly religious holidays. In some homes there are a lot of kind of quite obvious religious kind of symbolism, pictures or statues or something like that. But also it was a space that was particularly used on a Sunday. That was one of the days you were allowed to go in there.
But religion is not the key that unlocks the front room, I would say. That's not to deny that the front room itself gives the aspect of a series of altars that you've described, but they're not religious. They are as much moral. It's as much a moral code as a religious code.
Sociability and family, and how gatherings of people were special to you. You know, it was important that special occasions happened, that you used it on, you know, and that people came over, and say on Sundays if people had been to church and they came over and they had lunch and then they went into the front room and it was all, everything looked nice, and it was that sense of quite a, in a very gentle, subtle way, and quite ritual ways of socialising and enshrining people's time with each other.